I apologize first for not being able to be in the classroom this week. I know you're all going to make some awesome drawings without me. But first I wanted to make sure that everybody signed the attendance sheet before we get started talking a little bit in this kind of introduction video. Sign the attendance sheet, and I will make sure to keep track of that, make sure everyone gets credit for being in class today. So today, just to introduce a little bit about light and value structure, and then we'll be able to add that and translate it into our drawings. So the first rule I want to talk about is that each different value equals a different plane. So as you can see here, just really simply, these two planes that are equally facing the direction of the light source look equally light. But when one plane turns away from the light, that plane gets darker. Okay, very kind of simple, but when you think about it, it really tells a lot of the story about how we're going to see value structure within the model and then translate that to our drawings. So when those values are pushed towards the extremes of light and dark, as seen here in this example, it's called chiaroscuro. And this is a Renaissance term meaning light and dark. It means playing one value against the next for dramatic effect. So you can see that in this example here, the really kind of intense light coming down, and then those really dark, intense shadows in the background and on that wall. We only have two goals really when we're talking about this subject, and that is separating the light from the shadow and then the foreground from the background. Okay, so like you can see here, this one's really talking about this version of this drawing. I'm going to show you two here. It's really showing the way that line can separate the foreground from the background, and the way that the shadows are forming the kind of different planes of the body there in the foreground. And then as it's developed further, you can see how it becomes more subtle, and the background, instead of just being that line, ends up being more of a dark tone in the background. So a more successful version of this drawing, which actually integrates the background into the drawing and allows it to be something that sets behind the figure and pushes the figure forward. So as we're working, and I've talked about this before in terms of talking about anatomy and seeing the different proportions and forms of the figure, but we can also do this in terms of our shading and our light and our value. So we want to work from big and simple, then follow that up by adding small and complex. So in terms of big and simple, we have these major areas of tone here. And I want you to think about almost creating like simple shapes out of the figure and forming those in terms of these kinds of major areas of tone first, and then thinking about how you can pull out subtlety and detail within that structure, but sticking with it. So if an area is light, make sure that those details are staying within that light realm, and then if you're in an area that's dark, make sure those details are staying in that darker realm. So to kind of break this down a little bit further, talk about what each one of these mean. First off, we have, and arguably the most important, is the midtone or halftone. And this area of the form receives the majority of the light. It's the part that is kind of just what makes up when we see something existing in the world, we're seeing it in halftone for the most part. It's just the part that's kind of the majority of whatever it is that we're looking at. So here on the sphere, you can see that kind of middle area, that large middle area, it's called the midtone. And then off of that, we have the area called the highlight, and this is the area of the form that reflects light directly to our eye. This is creating the lightest light on the form. How this is very rarely like a true zero, but you can use just the white of the page or even like a white charcoal pencil to create this sense of a highlight. And then on the other side of the extremes here, so highlight's kind of the lightest extreme. On the darkest extreme, we have the core shadow. And the core shadow is the area on the form that can no longer receive direct light. It is the darkest part of the form and generally has soft edges, and that's really important. We want to make sure that that core shadow, when we're going for a more realistic feel, has those nice soft edges. Okay, and you can see that on the sphere there. And then getting a little bit more into reflected and kind of different types of light. We have the reflected light on the bottom of the sphere here, and that is where the light bounces all the way around, just kind of like think of it like light as like a handful of bouncy balls being tossed in a room. When it bounces back onto the form, it creates reflected light. Light, like these bouncy balls, loses intensity the more they bounce, so the reflected light is rarely as light as the halftone or highlight areas. So kind of you can see that it's a little bit less of a highlight than that big area on the top there that is the main highlight. And then we have the cast shadow. Cast shadows are created when a form blocks the light from hitting another form. So cast shadows generally have a harder edge, but that edge will soften the further it gets from the light source. So if something is really close to the light source, it'll have a really intense cast shadow with really intense edges, and then the farther away from the light source. And these are really flat shadows in terms of we're not going to be trying to create a sense of dimension as much within them. They are going to kind of follow the dimension of whatever they're being cast onto, and then the shape of them is going to be of whatever it is that's being cast. So we'll kind of going to deal with that a little bit differently than we're going to deal with kind of our form shadows here. So as an example, in this drawing here, you can see the kind of brightest bright highlights along the chest there, along the torso, coming down, and then on the front edge of that right side of the leg there, inner side of the right leg. So you can see that really bright highlight, and then you see the midtones coming off of that, and then those core shadows, which are going to be your darkest darks, those really kind of intense lines that you're seeing coming through the figure. And then the reflected light is what's on the right hand side, all of that's not just in pure black shadow. You can still see that core shadow along the edge, but you see that sort of reflected light coming through on the right side. Okay, one of the tricks I use a lot when I'm trying to figure out where my core shadows and where my light is coming from, and also how my figure and my background are going to relate to each other, is to either like squint or relax, or kind of like, so either like, squint your eyelids together, maybe even like cross your eyes a little bit as you're looking at either the photograph or the model in front of you, and you'll start to see kind of the larger areas of the shadows sort of become more pronounced, and then also the figure will start to separate from the background. And I'm going to talk a little bit as we're kind of going through the class now and talking more about value, if your drawing passes the squint test. So this is going to be the idea that if you were to kind of relax your eyes or squint at your drawing to make sure that your figure is coming out of the background, right? We want to make sure that the background and the foreground are kind of pushing and pulling each other so that the drawing lives kind of in front of that background. So it's really important, and we're going to talk about that a lot. So you kind of test it here where you kind of relax your eyes as you're looking at the photograph on the left, and see how those kind of shadows simplify, and you can really see just the changes in the overall value, and then do the same with the drawing on the right and see how those two kind of mimic each other. Alright, the next idea here, and this kind of just continues off with this idea of what a shadow is and how we can use it, is this idea of box logic. So up in the drawing up here, just so we're clear, the red lines are showing the corners. So you can see in terms of like the render detail, the ball and the tube are still very boxy, right? Only their contours say round, right? So if you're kind of looking at the differences between these different things and just looking at the highlight and the shadow, they look very similar, right? It's just the edges that change that, right? So as we're doing our shadowing, we can almost think of them like boxes. So notice how the ball and the tube are drawn in the same process as the box with the corner. This is called box logic. By finding the edge between the light and the shadow on any form, we found the principal corner for that form. So by thinking of the beginning of any shadow as a corner, we can come back to our definition of structure. Corners are corners whether you create them with line or tone, and whether you intend to round off those corners later. So you can kind of think about any time you lay down a shadow that you're actually creating a corner that's moving backwards in space away from you. Okay, so you can kind of see that happening here if you look at each one of these areas of shadow on the side of the figure, and think of that almost as a plane that is shifting or changing and moving backwards and away from you in space versus the highlighted plane, which is coming towards you or moving forward in the space. So again, shadows aren't just kind of looking for what type of gray to put down. This is actually kind of structurally building the dimensionality of our figures. As soon as you put in that shadow, you're actually making a corner, and that corner is then pushing that plane away from you in space. Okay, so finding the shape of the form, finding the shape of the shadow on the form, and then grouping the shadows that are darker are the main objective here. Okay, so finding the shape of the form and the shadow establishes a corner, and the shadow gives an instant and deep sense that whatever you're drawing is a fully three-dimensional form. Okay, so again, really thinking about the way that dark side is really kind of pushed away from the light side, and how you can create a sense of space as that's moving kind of in and out, up and down, kind of and away from you and towards you within the space of the figure. Okay, so next up, after we think about our shadows, is our halftones. So the halftone is everything in the light side that is not a highlight. This means the halftone can be almost as dark as the shadow and almost as light as the highlight. Whether you add a little or a lot, the character of the halftone is gradation. So it's always going to have kind of a changing from one to another. If the beginning of the shadow is a corner, then the halftone's most important job is to round the corner. The more gradation, the rounder the form gets. That means that we can render those spheres and tubes so they are completely convincing. Our two-value system of the box logic becomes two value ranges once we add halftones. Don't forget, still needs to pass the squint test. So what we're talking about here is kind of linking together our highlights and our shadows by using halftones. And again, instead of that making it look like a corner of a box, we're now making it look more like a sphere or like the soft edges that is in the figure. All right, so some common mistakes artists make when adding halftones. Sorry, just need to get my notes here. 1 second. Apologies. Here we go. So A is the kind of classic mistake of drawing the core shadow with a hard edge rather than a soft edge. So on that A, you can see that it just goes shadow to highlight, right? There's no kind of in between, and it also has a line to delineate that edge of the shadow, which we don't want. It's going to kind of give us too much of a darkness there. Right? B is drawing a straight line core to describe a round form. Curved form generally need curve details to explain them. So B, that straight line, not what we want, right? We want our shadows to feel curved just like the objects that they're describing. Number C here, or letter C, drawing the whole shadow so light that the viewer doesn't get that chiaroscuro pop, right? So if we don't have enough contrast, then we're just not going to get that kind of, doesn't pass the squint test. And when we're looking at it, there's just no difference between the two. It doesn't have enough going on there. All right, D is drawing the core shadow much darker than the body of the shadow. So we don't want that core shadow. We want it to be a little bit darker, but we don't want it to be so much darker that all you see is that line. We want it to have kind of a blended feel to it kind of all around. E is not accenting the corner with a slightly darker beginning. So this kind of gives you a gradation, which is really nice, but it doesn't give you that rounded effect, and it doesn't give you that kind of reflected light and the kind of core of that shadow. It just feels like it goes from one side to the other in a really flat way. F is making the outline significantly darker than the shadow value. So we don't want outlines, like I always say, to be bold and all the way around. If you're going to use an outline, make sure you're using it in the right places. Make sure you're using a variation of the line weight, and that darkness is related, the darkness of your line is related to your core shadow. You want those two tones to be matching each other. And then G is making the halftone darker than the shadow, which really seems kind of counterintuitive, but I want to make sure that you guys understand that there is a reflected light, but we do want the reflected light core shadow, and then the halftone. The core shadow should be the darkest, halftone should be a little bit lighter, and then we have our highlight. And then as you see here with the H, I, and J, those are just the kind of marker grayscale versions of the E, F, G, just to show you that even in grayscale, they don't really work. All right, so this is kind of the goal here. You can see that there is kind of a dark outline, but it is relating to the darkness of the core shadow. The core shadow is creating that rounded effect. The shape of it is following the form of the sphere itself. We have the reflected light between the outline and the core shadow, and then we have the halftone building up to the highlight, and then obviously the cast shadow there at the bottom. All right, so we can see that happening in some of these examples here. Specifically in this one, you can see the way that the round objects, like around the torso and the arms, you can see that the midtone is coming in from the outline on the edges. There's a core shadow when there's a really intense contrast needed, right? And then there's that highlight coming around. Okay, so the more you can see this, and again, feel free to always like relax your eyes and see that squint test and make sure that that figure is coming out. You can see here, I love this kind of really kind of intense, that like idea of a corner really shows through here, because you can see that edge that is like the hip there, and then the way that the shadow is kind of wrapping around the bottom of the thigh. So that really shows through and really helps bring kind of the structure to that figure there. Okay. Here, great use of the midtones, really seeing the way that the figure is kind of being lit from the right-hand side. That left arm is being pushed back into space and into kind of mid-tone shadow there. And the cast shadow of the breast there, don't get that confused with the idea of creating these types of corners. Again, the cast shadow is just going to be formed by whatever is the form that is kind of making the cast shadow. When we're talking about these kind of corners, we're talking about form shadows, so we're talking about the ones that are actually being made by the structure that they're sitting on top of. Okay, so next up is highlights. To understand highlights, think about a pool table, right? So this is a little diagram of a pool table here. So light strikes an object and bounces to our eye. That's how we see both the value and the color of any object. So study the image below. Think of the pool cue, which is that arrow there, as the light source, the ball as the light coming from the source, and the far bank as the object being lit, and the pockets as the positions of the artist/viewer. The light source washes over the form. As the form slowly rolls away from the light source, the light glances off of it with an ever-weakening effect. This is our halftone gradient. Right? So the highlight is a little different. It tends to stay at the area most directly facing the light source, but there is room for movement in that hot spot, which is really interesting. So notice that if neither the light source nor the object moves, but the viewer changes position, then that highlight can shift. The turquoise trajectory onto pocket 1 shows this, as opposed to the red line trajectory into pocket 2. So if you were to kind of imagine looking at like a shiny ball or surface, as you move around that ball, that highlight is going to move with you, right? And that is kind of one of those things where that highlight is actually a phenomenon of the light hitting your eye. So you are seeing that light hitting your eye, and that is what is happening when you see those really bright highlights. Okay, so those bright highlights are really important. They really help make a drawing pop, give that sense of the chiaroscuro. So really finding those and giving those a really bright sense of contrast is going to be really important. Okay, and rule 2, everything that receives light is a source of light. So this is when we start talking about reflected light. So as the light strikes the stair step, or an off-camera wall, it bounces back onto the ball sitting there. It won't bounce onto the light side because it's a weaker light source than the spotlight or sunlight that's powering the scene to begin with. The way it works is the light that bounces up off the step will lighten the planes that face down. The light that bounces to the right off the camera that faces right will lighten the plane that the face is left. So as you see, the ball is a little lighter than the core at the bottom and the bottom left. So you can see that little bit of reflected light there. That shadow corner or line of termination we accent with the core of darkness did several things for us. So as we're seeing that kind of core light there, and that's why we love that reflected light, because it gives us that ability to make that core light, the core shadow, sorry, because those two contrast each other. So look through these kind of little gestures here, which I love, and you can really see those intense highlights then that core shadow, and then that reflected light, which is to the other side of the core light. And we love this light here because it makes sure we've spotted the corner for our structure. It gives us that, and then again, the corner is another thing for like core shadow, the line of termination, however you want to say it, that dark edge inside our shadow. It was created as a soft mark to render our halftone gradient more easily out of it, so we can kind of take that dark core line and then create a gradation out of it, and it created a sense of bouncing light without getting bogged down with the theory. So it gives us, when we're kind of adding that dark core line, gives us a sense of that reflected light without having to think too much about the science of all the balls and the things bouncing around. So highlights are structure. They're super important. They'll help us create a sense of the form and the three-dimensionality of our figure. Remember, highlights move around with you. Those really bright, intense highlights will actually shift around a little bit. The trick is to keep them away from the shadow corner, so away from that core shadow. You want to have a little bit of distance there. That way, the highlight always suggests two plans of light. The process should always be shadow, halftones, then highlights, each having its own space. So as you can see here in these figures, you can see the darkness is those core shadows, right? The midtone or the paper is kind of living there, and then the highlights are spaced away. So we never see those two exactly right up next to each other. There's always a little bit of space kind of moving through there, and that allows us to, again, create that sense of the shift of the plane. Okay, and today I want you to be thinking about two things, obviously working with this idea of light and shadow and creating those ideas of the core shadows, but also within your gestures, I want you to just be thinking about adding a little bit of a midtone and maybe a little bit of that suggestion of the core shadow. I know we had tried this before, but I think now with more practice with our proportions and things, I think you can get a chance to go into that a little bit more. And I did want to show you some examples of just some, these are about 10 to 12 minute drawings, just to give you a sense of what can be accomplished in these like 20-minute drawings that you'll be doing today. So again, think about having an area of focus. Think about building up your midtones, which will create the contrast to have your highlights, and then again within those midtones having those core shadows. So if like you kind of examine that one arm here on the kind of left hand, that's just, you see the one kind of bottom of her top of the arm, you can see that kind of coming down from her elbow. You see that core shadow, you see the midtone over to the left, which then gives you that sense of the reflected light, and then the highlight on the inner side kind of closer to her face, so you get that sense of the light kind of bouncing and moving around. Okay. And it doesn't have to be elaborate in terms of adding the tone in. You can really just think about adding some kind of general, larger, broader strokes to just give you a sense of those midtones in there. Start thinking about just moving kind of whole limbs into different areas of the space and creating kind of broader kind of lines. Use like the sides of your vine charcoal or even your compressed charcoal if you'd like. Okay, so things like this where you can kind of just add a nice midtone to the bottom half of the legs just to create a sense of that dimensionality. Okay, so today you're going to be doing a set of gestures. You're going to be doing 5 2-minute gestures and then 3 5-minute gestures. So we're going to do several short ones and then a couple a little bit longer ones, and then we're going to move into a series of 20-minute drawings. So work with your model today. Her name's Miriam. She's great. She's going to help us out, I know, since I'm not there, but getting the poses and things situated. So, work with her. Please be respectful and take your time getting yourself set up here, but, stay on track and, kind of pretend as if I was there. And, with your gestures, really try, experiment. Now, we've done those ink drawings. I think you can all feel a little bit freer to use a little bit more kind of value and tone and get in there a little bit more to see what you can do within even the faster drawings to create a sense of tone. Okay, we are going to be using just the drawing paper today. If you want to use some white chalk to go in and define some of those really bright highlights, feel free. It is going to be just charcoal on the drawing paper today. There's going to be several 20-minute drawings. You can do all of them on separate pieces of paper, or you can do, 3 on one page, 1 on another page. There's going to be 4 of them, so kind of space that out how you want on your drawing paper. Feel free to do up to 3 on one page if you'd like. And then for next class, you'll need a sheet of gray paper that you can either buy, like a sheet of gray toned paper at the bookstore, or you can make it. Just put a thin layer of charcoal down on your drawing paper and then spray it with spray fixative like crazy. Make sure you're in a ventilated area or in the spray booth down in the Idea Studio. Test it by trying to erase it if you could, and if you can't erase it, then it's in a good spot, because we want to be able to add to the drawing and erase away and still get back to that gray if we can. Alright, so that can be a test to see if the gray paper is ready to go. So have that for Thursday or Wednesday, depending on the class that this is going to be playing in, for next class, and just make sure that you are ready with your white charcoal that day for sure. You will need that for sure with that paper. So that'll be next class. There'll be another video. I again won't be in class next time, but starting next week I will be back. Everything's good, everything's fine. Don't worry about it. Everything's gonna be okay. But just unforeseen circumstances kept me away this week. But I will be back next week. If you are still waiting for your portfolio review or me to look at your sketchbooks, I will be updating everyone on that next week. So just keep an eye out for that. If you have any questions or anything, please feel free to email me or just let me know. Next week I will be around then. Okay, thanks everyone. Have a great day drawing, and I look forward to seeing you next week. And I will talk to you again via video next class.